Hey, scholars. Let's talk about forecasting, chapter 4 out of the textbook. The first thing that I believe is very important in forecasting is that we have a basic understanding of economics. And there's 5 points on the simple supply and demand chart. I think you need to know what those are. The first is the y-axis, which is the vertical axis, typically costs, revenue, dollars. The x-axis, the horizontal axis, typically units, units of time, units of volume, etc. The demand curve is the downward sloping curve. The supply curve is the upward sloping curve. Then where those two intersect is the equilibrium point. Equilibrium point is, of course, where supply meets demand, and also it tells you at what level of cost of revenue that you're receiving, the number of units is at a break-even point, meaning that your fixed costs and your variable cost equal your total revenue, as we put in another chart we put on the board. There's 3 different types of forecasts: short-term, medium-term, and long-term forecast, and they're each used for different things. The short-term forecast, the text says it's up to 3 months. Sometimes your short-term forecast is for the next day, oftentimes for the next week, where you have to anticipate volumes and make sure that you've got the production capacity in place to, in fact, achieve those volumes within the quality means that you want. Let's see, going through the chapter here. We talked about quantitative versus qualitative types of forecasting. Quantitative, of course, is numbers-based. Qualitative is intuition-based, more or less. The type of quantitative analysis that I like to do is based on fact as much as possible. So what did the past tell us, and what can we use from the past to anticipate the future? An example that we used in class was a restaurant. In the restaurant, we can tell certain things. We can tell how much we expect a customer to pay for a dinner, for instance, an average customer. We can tell how much our costs would be based on whatever that average revenue would be. And the cost we'd be talking about would be our variable costs, which would be our food costs and our labor costs for the most part. We know what our fixed costs are, which would be a forecast of our rent, our utilities, things of that nature. And so then what we can do is we can have a pretty good idea in terms of are we going to make money or not make money in this business based on that forecast. So quantitative analysis based on things that we know or things that we can surmise of the future based on things that we expect. What don't we know in that forecast? Well, we really don't know how many customers are going to come in. So you got to take your best guess on that. If you're forecasting for a hotel on the beach, well, you're going to forecast 2016 based on what happened in 2015, which was a pretty darn good year for hotels on the beach. What you're not anticipating is a hurricane. So we get a hurricane and another Hurricane Ivan comes through, but maybe it comes through in early July, then that's going to have a significant impact on the rest of the summer. But that's one of those things that we're just not going to include in our forecast. Our traditional forecast, we may include it in a contingency plan, which would essentially be a forecast based on this particular act of God, and then we would adjust our forecast accordingly, knowing that we would adjust our operation accordingly based on that. So we'd have to fire a lot of people, we'd have to do whatever we have to do to make the summer work if we have that situation happen. So we talked about different types of forecasting. The one that I spent more time on than the others was regression analysis, linear regression analysis. Linear meaning it's a line. The formula y equals mx plus b is the formula for a straight line, and that's what you're doing with regression analysis. So you're taking data points from the past and you're then using those data points from the past to anticipate what the future is going to be. I gave you the example of Universal Card Services, where we spent a lot of time trying to predict what the revenues would be in the upcoming year, and then when you plotted the data points from past years and made a straight line from those past years going into the future, it became pretty evident that the forecast was little more than a linear view of linear continuation of the past. So that's an important point to know. So within the data, within the forecast for regression analysis, there's a couple of things that you should be aware of, and I posted a video on that. I thought that was a pretty good video. But you should know the R squared. So the R squared essentially tells you what is the determination or the difference between the data points that you have in the past and your best fit line or your regression line. And the lower the R squared is going to range from 0 to 1. And the lower the R squared, the closer it is to 0, the less correlated your data is. And the higher it is, closer to 1, the more correlated your data is. So if your data had an R squared of 1, that would mean that your data points were all right in a line, and your regression line was right on top of those data points. And if it was closer to 0, basically you've got data points that might go way up here. You can't see my finger, but way down here, kind of all over the place. So you're going to be able to put a regression line in there, but it's not going to tell you a lot because the degree of accuracy per that R squared is very low. It essentially means that the data points are not very well correlated to the regression line. So that's important that we know that too. I think there's a lot of math in this chapter and in the chapter in my book on forecasting. In my book, the key points that I go over are more basic forecasting, which is a weighted moving average forecast. They talk about it in this textbook too. Sorry about that. And I think that's pretty much going to wrap up on forecasting. Again, there's other things in the textbook which you may very well need. I use a lot of the techniques that we discuss in either of the texts in my business on a daily basis. Any place that you go to work as an operations manager, they're going to have a forecasting tool that they're using, probably Microsoft Excel based, for their production department, and they're going to have probably some economic models depending on the sophistication of the organization for their midterm and long-term analyses that they're doing to determine things like how much more capacity do we need into the future, or do we need in the shorter term, do we need to be looking at maybe 1 to 3 years? Do we need to be looking at going to 3 shifts versus 2 shifts versus 1 shift, etc. All right, so that's it on forecasting. I'll see you all tomorrow evening at class.